Daubert, this issue of falsifiability came up as one of the factors that courts should consider when deciding admissibility. And Justice Rehnquist, and I'll probably butcher the paraphrase, but Justice Rehnquist basically said that he had the utmost confidence in the federal bench to understand the great number of particular issues and terms. But when it came to falsifiability, he said that he didn't understand what falsifiability meant, and he wasn't sure that the judges on the federal bench, by and large, would understand that topic. I feel confident that at the end of Professor Gates' presentation today, everybody in the room will understand the concept of falsifiability and what it means. Jim Gates is the Ford Foundation Professor of Physics, an affiliate mathematics professor and faculty fellow at the Watson Institute for International Studies and Public Affairs at Brown University. He has served on the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, contemporaneously on the Maryland State Board of Education from 2009 to 2016, and the National Commission on Forensic Science from 2013 to 2016. He's known for his work on supersymmetry, supergravity, and superstring theory. He is a fellow of the American Physical Society, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and the Institute of Physics in the UK. He's also an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Philosophical Society. And in 2013, he was elected to the National Academy of Sciences, becoming the first African-American theoretical physicist so recognized in its 150-year history. Professor Jim Gates.
Thank you, Matt. It's my both pleasure and dread to be standing in front of you today. Matt and our colleagues on the National Commission for Forensic Science allowed me to be part of the commission. And I always felt like, you know how sometimes little boys will break into their parents' bedroom and put on one of dad's overcoats, and you know the coat doesn't quite fit, it's down to the floor, and the kid is just swimming in this garment. That's how I have always felt when I would go to a commission meeting, and how I have repeatedly felt since when members of your community have asked me to come and speak, because what is that saying? I'm not worthy. I'm not worthy. But you allow me to come, and I do bring, I think, an outside perspective. And I've effectively been studying you. Because that's what scientists do. We study things and we think about it, and we try to put together narratives to explain what it is that we see. And so this talk today is not going to be of much practical benefit to any attorneys in here or judges. I have to thank so many people, including the preceding panel, which was just great for the setup for my presentation, especially Chris's comment about the standards being argued in court, because these are the kinds of things that people like me, for about a decade or so, have been advocating that that's how you get good science in the court, is that you go by this standards of science. So let's get on with this story, and I hope to leave some time, and I hope I did over-prepare slides. So this is bio. Matt's already done that. I've got 3 program objectives. I'll come back. I'm going to fly past those, and we'll see whether I got there. So, as Matt mentioned, I actually went out and found this quote. The Chief Justice said, "I defer to no one in my confidence in federal judges, but I am at a loss to know what is meant when it is said that the scientific status of a theory depends on its falsifiability, and I suspect some of them will too. In a phone call, our colleague said the following: in the Daubert decision, I'm not sure which way he pronounced it on the phone, Chief Justice Rehnquist confessed to being confounded by the principle of falsifiability and doubted his colleagues on the federal bench understood it any better than he. Our aim is to begin to right that ship, and that's really what we're going to try to do today. So, as a stranger, as a scientist, although I'm a theoretical physicist, because of who I am and my life trajectory, I'm somewhat of an amateur anthropologist, meaning that when I interact with groups, I sort of start thinking about them the way that an anthropologist would think about going off to some strange land and observing some tribe and getting the customs together. And so I bring that mindset as I have watched you for the last 6 years. And so I'm going to try to give you my reflection of who I think you are as a community. And it begins with timeline. So we're going to try to go through some timelines of developments. But curiously enough, let me get you to the punchline, and then we're going to come back and I'll try to explain why the punchline is true. We are in this situation because of Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein created all the problems for forensic science in the judiciary in the United States today. It all goes back to Albert Einstein. Now that might seem like a very strange statement, but by the end of my presentation, I hope to have convinced you that this statement has an element of at least some accuracy, if not total accuracy to it. Now, the concept of falsifiability, which Matt mentioned, started with a philosopher named Karl Popper, and we see his image here. So let's get into forensic science. Well, there's some evidence that the first sorts of etymology to solve criminal investigations occurred in China about the year 1248. So forensic science actually has a long leading tail that most people never think about. 1858, we have William Herschel in the Indian Civil Service, who starts using thumbprints as a means for security because there was rampant sort of forging of signatures, and in terms of identification, thumbprints were more reliable than signatures. 1879, Albert Einstein gets born. 1902, we have Karl Popper's birth. 1915, Einstein completes the theory of general relativity. And I bet you never expected to hear general relativity in the forensic science talk, right? But it's actually part of your story. In 1919, Karl Popper in 1918 enters the University of Vienna, and he's interested as an entry student in both math and physics. Now remember, he winds up a philosopher, but he starts off as a student thinking about math and physics. And it turns out that that combination of traits in a single individual will play a very prominent role in getting us to where we are today. 1919, Arthur Eddington, English astronomer, heads two teams. One headed to Sobral, Brazil. The other headed to Principe, which is an island off the west coast of Africa. And they make some observations there. And what's really interesting for me today, it's a very great honor for me to be here today, because you see, today is the 100-year anniversary on which those observations were made. So this is actually a day of great celebration in the physics community. In fact, while I was sitting here, I got a message from a colleague at Brown University who's actually at Principe today, saying he made it on the anniversary of this measurement that establishes Einstein and his work in the global consciousness. 1919, in September, Arthur Eddington announces the results of his observations. And they do something stunning in physics. In fact, this is the first principal example I know in history where an idea of physics gets falsified. The idea that gets falsified is Newton's law of universal gravitation. This observation falsifies the thing that you learned in high school, the thing that in all your physics class, people study planets, how the forces attract. This was falsified in 1919 by the observations that came out of Eddington's two expeditions. So that's when falsification starts to enter into the scientific mind. This prompts some headlines in the New York Times. The lights are all askew in the heavens. Men of science more or less agog, or I didn't know, it says agag, but agog over results of eclipse observations, and Einstein's theory triumphs. Here's some PDF scans of that part of the headline page of the New York Times on this day. I'm sorry, the day after tomorrow, 100 years ago. And this statement about only 12 wise men can understand what Einstein has done was propagated at that time. But time, of course, goes on. And curiously enough, if you look at the time sequence, you see that the Fry decision was only made 4 years later, totally unconnected, apparently, right? So we have the Fry decision in jurisprudence talks about the context of admissibility of systolic blood pressure deception tests as probative evidence. So we can start to see these two, what you might think that science and law don't meet, we can actually start to see their convergence at this very early stage, long before today. In 1928, Popper actually defends his PhD thesis. It's called On the Problem of Methodology of Thinking, of Psychology of Thinking. And what he was actually looking at in modern language was how innovation and creativity gets generated by intellectual minds. That's the subject of this particular thesis. How do creative people create innovative new ideas, intellectual ideas? In 1935, he publishes The Logic of Research. It's published in German, but it is his first time in a written, large, expansive account that he talks about falsification. Now, falsification, it turns out, solves a problem. And the problem, basically, that he observed as a student, as he's in Vienna, University of Vienna, is the following question. How do you tell science from pseudoscience? That's what he wondered about. What do you use to distinguish? He called this the problem of demarcation. So how do you solve the problem of demarcation? And by the way, this was not some mental exercise that he was going through, because you see, at that point in Vienna, there were other scientific theories that were being born. There was this scientific theory of there was this theory of economics called Marxism. There was also being born at this point the theory of psychology that we associate with Freud. And so, as a student in this intellectually vibrant environment, as a bright student, starts thinking about some observations he makes. And the observations he makes are about the way that the proponents of these various scientific ideas, how they interact with observation and data. And what he concludes is something very odd. Every piece of data that he or his friends could present to people who, by the way, he became a Marxist, and later I became a Marxist. But every piece of data that was presented that he thought should invalidate Marxism, the proponents of Marxism said, oh, no. This validates this part of the Marxist theory of economic development. And the same thing went on with the Marxian school of psychology. People say, well, here's a set of aberrant behavior that surely you can't describe in the context of psychology as formulated by Freud. And the proponents say, no, of course we can. It just does this. And then he notices that, in fact, Einstein welcomed falsification. Einstein said, if these three predictions do not hold from my theory, then my theory has been falsified. And a falsified theory is not a basis for building science. So this is where the whole falsification paradigm actually arises in science. It comes from Albert Einstein. But it takes Karl Popper, to translate what was the lived experiences of these scientists into a coherent description of how science works. And that's essentially what Popper did the rest of his life. He was to elaborate on that. He also talked about, there's a work on social sciences where he in fact is extraordinarily critical of the idea that the social sciences can become predictive in the same way that the physical and natural sciences are. Because basically, although he wouldn't have the language, I think today the language we would use is those systems are too chaotic. And in chaotic systems, we're still wrestling with how to, this day, how to describe accurately the behavior of chaotic systems. For those of you who may not be familiar with such words, let me just say turbulence. Turbulence in fluids is not understood to this very day. That's a chaotic system. So that's an example of where we bump up to the limits of what science can tell us. And so Popper, even back in the 30s, said there are some things that we're just not at the stage where we can describe scientifically. 1937, he leaves Germany. Well, so Karl Popper was born to a family that was nominally Jewish, but they were not practicing Jews. In fact, they converted to Episcopalianism, I believe it was the choice of the conversion. And so they were no longer practicing the traditions of the Jewish faith, but you know, they had all of the best traits that we associated with that culture, a culture of study, a culture that values intellectualism. You know, a lot of people say it's because the Talmud is such an important document, right, in that faith. And so he continues that, but because that's his background, he can see what's about to happen in Germany. So he and his wife immigrate to New Zealand, and he takes up a position there at the university, and he publishes in 1957 a book called The Poverty of History. And this gives, as I said, this critique on trying to turn social sciences so that they are models to follow, that they have followed the model of the physical sciences. In 1946, he returns to England at the London School of Economics. 1955, Einstein dies here in the United States in Princeton, New Jersey. 1959, Popper completes completes several works on the propensity of interpretation of probabilities. That should ring a bell for us because, as we know, if you have a large system where there's lots of uncertainties, the only thing that you can do as a scientist to describe the system is talk about probabilities. And in particular, this work is dedicated looking at the issue of probabilities in the confines of quantum mechanics, that strange set of rules that governs electrons and atoms that is nothing like what Sir Isaac Newton dreamt ever could be a description of reality. This discussion by Popper is on that topic. 1963, he returns with a work on falsification, because when he says conjectures and refutation, that's really a description of what he describes as the basic engine of science that drives scientific progress. And we're going to come back to that. By 1963, his contributions are so widely recognized in the philosophic and scientific community that he's made into a knight by the Queen of England. And then in 1969, he retired from the London School of Economics. Let me interject here, the word retirement does not mean the same for everybody. I am a retired professor. I retired in 2017, but I failed retirement because it only lasted 12 hours. So, following the Popperian example, turns out that Popper is still active after retirement. And you'll see that he did a work, an exchange article on the Bayesian approach to he actually talks about probability, but in fact, around 1970, another very interesting paper from our modern perspective appears in legal jurisprudence. This is a paper by Finkelstein and Farley. It's a series of articles on the Bayesian approach to identification evidence, and trial by mathematics by Tribe at Harvard University also triggers a continuing discussion in the legal community about the role of probabilities in the courtroom. And we are still doing that to this very day. 1974, Popper completes a compendium of his life's work, basically, the philosophy of Karl Popper, and then in 76, sort of an appendum to that. And then we're now starting to get to the modern era as we start thinking about forensic science. In 1986, Alec Jeffrey uses variations in DNA genetic code among individuals to solve a double murder case in England. Again, in 1986, their forensic analysis is used in the criminal investigation in the United States in the case of Commonwealth versus Pestinitis. And this is the first use of polymerase chain reaction, namely you can take a small sample of DNA now, and you can reproduce it to get samples from which you can make reliable assays. 1988, the Technical Working Group on DNA Analysis Methods is formed by our colleagues at NIST. So they were, I hope I got the date right, during the period of the introduction of DNA methodology entering the practice of forensic science in the US. And I have to check with my colleagues, maybe I blew the date on that one. 1989, there's a case of People versus Castro. A judge in a Fry hearing in New York rules that DNA evidence was acceptable generally, but that the laboratory analysis in the case was inadmissible due to inappropriate application of technology. That's what standards is all about, right? That nowadays we're starting to set standards to prevent these sorts of things. Guidelines were promulgated by, and that's supposed to be a G there, I believe, recognized by the Minnesota State Court in, the Minnesota Supreme Court in State versus Schwartz. I'm going to come back to this 1989 curious development because it's curious to me and I hope it will be to you, but it's sort of a sideline, but still something I think that could be noted. In 1993, the Supreme Court holds in Daubert versus Merrill Dow Pharmaceuticals that the federal rule of Federal Evidence 702 requires admissibility of scientific testimony to be decided through flexible or scientific validity, the flexible or scientific validity standard, rather than solely on the basis of the general acceptance of purported scientific methods in the scientific community, which is basically what one reading of the previous interpretation of the Fry standard. 1994, Popper dies. 1994 also sees the passage of the Federal DNA Identification Act. 1979, the Supreme Court clarifies or modifies Daubert in the case of General Electric versus Joyner by holding that under Rule 702, district court judges have the discretion to inquire not merely about the validity of the general method used to produce the evidence, but also to exclude a scientist's conclusions if there's simply too great a gap between the analytical, between the analytical part of the analysis and the opinion that's offered by the expert in court. 1999, the Scientific Working Group on DNA analysis methods is formed, again by our colleagues at NIST. Eventually, this grows into 21 or 24 weeks, depending on how you count, which now we have actually seen in the previous presentation with that wonderful chart, which I like so much. I'm going to show it again. 1999, the third sort of pillar of Daubert comes into existence with the Supreme Court holding in the Kumho Tire case versus Carmichael that all types of expert testimony, judges may apply factors enumerated in Daubert to assess scientific evidence. In fact, the judges are now explicitly named as gatekeepers. 2000, the forensic crime television series, CSI, Crime Scene Investigation, or CSI begins its broadcast to audiences. And you might wonder, what in the world does that have to do with this stuff? I'm going to come back and try to touch on that. But it's a show that creates what some of us call a CSI effect. And as you were mostly concerned with legal matters, you're probably thinking about the CSI effect that you perhaps have heard prosecuting and defense attorneys talk about in the trying of cases. But since I'm an academician, I'm actually referring to a different CSI effect. So let me take you there in my shoes, so to speak. In 2009, the Academy releases its Path Forward report, which is a monumental marker in this process. 2013, the U.S. Department of Justice, jointly with NIST, create the National Commission on Forensic Science. And it was my very great honor to be part of that commissioner class, and there are a number of people in this room that were in that endeavor also. And it marks the first time in history that a national forum was created for all the stakeholder communities. And this is a very complex community. And I'm going to come in and I can talk to you about that in this presentation, because remember I told you I'm kind of an anthropologist, and one of the first questions I asked when I was given this duty of looking at your community is to ask the question, who exactly are these people? Because they're not like any other STEM community I have ever seen in my 60-some-odd years of life. So who are they? And I'm going to come back and try to tell you a clarifying view of what I think who you are. 2014, MOSAC gets formed and it has its first meeting in the fall. 2014 also, the Forensic Science Standards Board was created and functions with a complete membership by that October. It serves as the OSAC governing board and oversees operations in all resource committees, scientific area subcommittees, approves standards for the registry, and facilitates communication both internal and external for the groups that involved in these standard setting exercises. In 2016, the president at the time impanels his PCAST to look at what's been happening in forensic science. This is an effort that was led by Eric Lander, someone I'm sure many of you have had some contact with. I was a member of the subgroup of PCAST that was working on this report with Eric. Partly because of my experience on the commission, it was felt that I might have some value to this new exercise for PCAST. And let me at this point say something about PCAST to make sure everyone in the room understands how PCAST operated, at least while I was there. PCAST wrote almost 40 reports in the almost 8 years that I was serving on PCAST. This is by a factor of at least 4, maybe 5, greater than the number of reports ever written by any previous PCAST group. These reports ranged all over the place. Wherever issues of science, technology, engineering, or mathematics touched on public policy at the national level, PCAST was often tasked to bring back, basically do an analysis and then bring back to the office of the president sets of recommendations that would move the needle forward on progress. PCAST was not a debating society. Oftentimes I hear people describe PCAST as a bunch of professors. They go lock themselves in a room, they go read up on some books, and then they think they're experts. That's not how PCAST ever operated. PCAST, in every single one of its reports, always was serving what I call the executive function. Namely, the office of the president had a question. PCAST acted as the think tank for the president to first of all, to scope the question down to something that experts in the field could answer, then to seek out the experts in the field who knew the ground truth of whatever the issue was in order to formulate responses to the question, and then to deliver to the office of the president a set of recommendations that, as I said a moment ago, would move the needle. That meant that every PCAST report was not PCAST just proclaiming something. Typically, in a typical PCAST report, the proportion of discussants outside of PCAST compared to the number of people in PCAST who wrote the report was at least a factor of 2 to 3 to 1. So PCAST was not a debating society. It was never a debating society that just went to this room and said, we know what the answer is. What it was charged with is going to find an answer among people who should have insight into the questions being asked. And our forensics report was written in the same manner as all the others. Our report talked about two kinds of validity: foundational validity, that is empirical studies that are repeatable, reproducible, and accurate at measured levels and are appropriate for the intended application, scientific correspondence to the part of 702 that's reliable principles and methods, and then as well, validity as applied. That is, were the best standards, which we are now hearing coming forth quite copiously, were the best standards followed in the particular application of the technology by this particular expert to this particular case? The report only covered 5 areas. I mean, a lot of people, when you talk to them about PCAST forensics, they make it sound like PCAST went after the whole field. That's not what happened. The only concentration of the PCAST report was in pattern matching. And in pattern matching, what we looked at was DNA analysis of samples, both from single source and multiple source, and as well as complex mixtures. We looked at odontology, bite marks. We looked at latent fingerprints. We looked at firearm identification, and we looked at footwear analysis. Those were the only areas that were examined by the PCAST report. They all fall in this category of pattern matching, which we've actually heard mentioned several times here before today. And we did, however, we did a literature search on the issue of hair analysis. So that's the contents of the report. Those were the areas that we were asked to, that the report covered. 2017, the charter of the National Commission on Forensic Science expires. As well, in 2017, Attorney General Sessions created an internal forensic science working group, which today I was informed might actually have another name, so I have to track that down in my detective work, for improving the accuracy of the Department's forensic science practitioners' testimony. And we've heard about testimony today, assessing the needs for crime labs nationwide, and developing a coordinated agenda for federal forensic science research. Einstein has also had an impact outside of criminal law. There's the case of Kitzmiller versus Daubert Area School District, and Judge John Jones III ruled in part that intelligent design was not a scientific proposition because it is not falsifiable. So here we have an example where, again, the fact that Einstein was able to falsify in a prescribed way Newtonian gravity, something you would think is far removed from anything that takes place in the court of law. Here we have an example where this principle has been taken into our jurisprudence quite vigorously. So where are we now? Well, we have earlier today several times heard reference, certainly in the last 2 presentations, to the 2009 report, A Path Forward, Strengthening Forensic Science in the United States. I've just reviewed, as well as some of my previous colleagues, reviewed the work in 2016 of the forensic science report that was given to the President, the Office of the President. The Justice Department and NIST continue to function as the government's primary agencies for moving the issue of forensic science forward. In particular, in 2014, when we had the National Commission on Forensic Science, the National Commission was jointly stood up by both NIST as well as Department of Justice as FACA, and it was charged with providing recommendations to the Attorney General. On the other hand, if you look at the right-hand part of this diagram, you can see that our colleagues at NIST have developed an extensive structure that is around practices. The DOJ is about policy. NIST is about practices, and that's why we hear about standards and the testing and what have you, and the registry. All of that is in the NIST bailiwick of this issue of forensic science in the United States. 2017, it changed on the DOJ side when the Attorney General replaced the former National Commission on Forensic Science with the Forensic Science Working Group. Is that a good or bad thing? I don't know. One could perhaps argue both ways. Normally, when you seek advice, you might want to hear a perspective that's not aligned completely with your own. And so that's what's missing in this present structure, as far as I understand it. It does not have a way for bringing in outside scientists to talk about ideas. Why might that be important? Well, let me just give you one example. Our laws on illicit drugs in this country are governed by a list of controlled substances. And yet, because technology is advancing, people who actually make drugs can make tiny changes in the molecular structure of the drug so that a designer drug, as it's called, isn't quite chemically the same as the original. And therefore, if you're going to have a list of controlled substances, then you're going to have to be chasing after what these drug designers do, because they're changing the chemical signatures of these designer drugs. So one idea that, a neurobiologist suggested some time ago was, well, maybe what we ought to do is base the description of illicit drugs on how they bind to receptors in the brain. Because that's where you get the effects of these illicit drugs. So instead of chasing after all of these chemical designers, why don't you have a list that's based on brain activation, receptor activation? That's something that we know how to measure these days. As far as I know, that hasn't happened yet. That's what an outside idea can do. It can change the paradigm of how you actually go about doing your business. And so in the absence of that, you have amateurs like me saying, gee, what about receptor-dependent list of controlled substances? As opposed to having true professionals within the field, perhaps developing this technology, at least judging its feasibility, and developing this so that we get out of this paradigm of having to chase the drug designers. That's what you miss without outside recommendations. The twigs, here I have the number 24, I'm confused. There are 24 little balls here. I'm not quite sure all 24 are functioning, but this is what the structure looks like for the scientific working groups. A tremendous organization. I've had the great privilege of serving for 1 year on the Forensic Science Standards Board, which I'll get to in a moment. And in that capacity, had the chance to observe the work of these groups as it came forward up to the FSSB for approval of new standards and what have you. And so for several years, I've been telling the world that I am confident that this community is going to get this set of issues right about science and forensic science. Partly from exposure to these folks and the great work they're doing, but also from what has actually happened in this room today. I was commenting to Matt before my presentation that during the presentations of other folks here today, I have been surprised at the rapidity at which many of the ideas that were controversial a few years ago now seem to be part of the genetic structure of forensic scientists. And this is what I always actually predicted would happen, is that this community would ultimately figure out that us outsiders, we're not actually the enemy. Matt was in the room too. I was once accused of being part of a group trying to destroy the U.S. jurisprudence and criminal justice system. Well, that's not really what we're after, folks. If someone wants to do that, writing about string theory like Sheldon Cooper is not the way to do it. Let's do something different if that's your goal. But if your goal is to talk about the quality of science and what it means to do science, and that's something I've been engaged in all of my adult life, then if someone asks me if this other thing, which has the word science in its name, if it meets the general accepted definitions of science, if I find that there's a misalignment, I am duty bound to tell you that's what I see. Now, none of us likes to have a stranger dropping, imagine some strange person comes in your house and tells you how to rearrange the furniture. You're probably not going to be very happy about that. So we understand that this is a message that perhaps was not so easily received in the community, but by the same token, it's also a statement that we are confident your community can do this. And as I said, the talks I've heard today give me more confidence than ever that you yourselves will do this, not a bunch of outsiders. We can be the catalyst to raise the questions, but some combination of you will be the people to A, make the judgment whether the questions make sense, and B, to find answers to those questions. That won't be us outsiders, that will be you. Because we don't know the ground truth of what you do. Only you have that knowledge. The other part of the structure that I was mentioning was the Forensic Science Standards Board, which I had a great privilege to serve on for a year and watch the work of the SWIGs as it came up through the SACs and what have you, the Scientific Area Working Groups. And so, as I said, I'm more confident than ever that we're going to get a quality of science in this country, forensic science in this country, that people like me can walk down the street and have a stranger walk and say, that CSI show, how close is that to reality? I'd like to be able to say, yeah, that's a pretty good representation. And I'm looking forward to that day. But of course, CSI is no longer on. So I talked about CSI effects. The one effect that I have heard about sometimes discussed in the legal community is that some prosecuting attorneys say that the fact that this show has had such wide dissemination in our society has changed the expectations of juries as they hear cases. They want cases in the courtroom to look like what they've seen on television, with whiz-bang displays and the kind of discussion of computer-generated models and all the things that are part and parcel of that television show, that has changed the appetite for the general population for what appears in the courtroom. Now, I don't know if this is true, and I understand that there's some sociologists who dispute this matter, but at least we should give it some thought that our clients, the public, may expect more from us than they did a decade or so ago. The other CSI effect, which I have experienced and lots of my colleagues have experienced, is in universities. Because when that show came on television, we saw an upsurge of young people coming to the university saying, I want to be a scientist. And they would say that until they took their first college level science course. So, what did Popper do? Well, before Popper, science was thought to be, sometimes we use the word verificationism, namely, that it was an activity that verified a bunch of facts, brought them together in a theory that the facts provided the foundation. But what Popper does, based on watching the development of general relativity principally, as well as quantum mechanics ultimately, what Popper does is uncover evidence that that's not actually how science works. And what science really does is the following, according to Popper. He called it the hypothetical deductive model. He proposed that there are two components. And the first component consists of forming hypotheses. Now, what's really interesting about this part, well, first of all, to Popper, he doesn't care how you get the hypothesis. You could say I found it on a Ouija board, or maybe I went to a tarot set of tarot cards, and I found this hypothesis. He doesn't care. He doesn't. And what's really great about that is it allows for the full range of human creativity to be brought to bear on the effort to do science. If you don't care where you're getting the hypotheses from, you're not restricting how people get them. That's the first part of it. He says, scientists get hypotheses, and he doesn't, it can come from a dream, like it can tarot cards, he doesn't care where it comes from. But the second part of his model is that when that hypothesis is formed by someone making a claim that it's science, that hypothesis must be falsifiable. That's for him how science works. And as someone who's endeavored to do science their entire adult life, this model is pretty much what I've experienced in my lifetime. Is that you don't care where the ideas come from. You care that they're falsifiable. And that's what makes the dividing line. So this whole idea of falsifiability is an enormous paradigm shift. There's something very interesting that I want to point out for this audience, that if you believe in this paradigm shift, namely that A, form a hypothesis, and then B, you use observation and experiment to try to falsify the hypothesis, that is 180 degrees, as I understand the legal system, for how a theory of a case works. Right? In law, when you try to formulate a theory of the case, the whole exercise of having a trial or dispositive process is that you're trying to prove the theory of the case works, is accurate, which is exactly the opposite of what scientists are doing. When we have a hypothesis, we're trying to prove that it's inaccurate or invalid. So this very subtle misalignment between when you get to the point of the hypothesis, as we scientists might call it, or in the legal regime you might call a theory of the case, this misalignment is something that's going to be very subtle to work out, and that's why we need you folks to take the lead here. Because I can tell you, my committee is not going to figure that out. It's going to have to be some combination of the legal community and the forensic science community that figures out where does this divergence work. Now, I do have a preference. My claim is in legal presentations and events, I would vote for having the standards of science apply to the science in the case, but then after that, you folks, it's in your court. So it's around the science in the case where I'm confident applying the rules and the way and the methodologies of science, but when it leaves the science, I'm afraid you're responsible. Because scientists can't be. We're not trained to navigate that strange land between observations and verified and validated theories and how that translates into a set of finders of facts in a court case. That's your responsibility. One thing about this whole business about validation, or rather falsifiability, is the other thing that in your approach, the way that you build up support for a theory of a case is you bring in more and more observations. But in science, that actually doesn't work. There's a very famous example of that. First of all, the statement of Popper that only the falsity of a theory can be inferred from empirical evidence, and this inference is purely a deductive one. There's a very famous example of this. Let's see, I'm sorry. Let me go forward and backwards. Well, I'll tell the story because I can't find this slide. I've somehow disordered it. For several hundred years, everyone believed swans were white. But in the 1680s or so, a Dutch explorer was in Australia and noticed that there were black swans. Now, prior to that happening, for hundreds of years, people had seen only white swans, and therefore you could have said, we're going to have this expedition to Lake Geneva, and we'll look for the swans, and gee, they're all white, and let's go down the Danube, and gee, we found more of these white swans, and you can follow Danube down to its mouth, and you just see white swans, and you say, I keep seeing more and more evidence that only white swans exist. But as this actual historical case shows, that evidence is itself misleading. And so what Popper recognizes is that the accumulation of evidence does not provide validation for scientific theory. And that's, again, this misalignment between the law and, So the key takeaway is in the general scientific community, empirical evidence and observation, that is measurement for accuracy and reliability over time, are not regarded as nice ways to create foundations for scientific efforts. They are regarded as the only ways that one creates foundations for scientific efforts. And as I said, what I'm voting for is when science comes to the courtroom, that you apply that standard to what is called science. So that when you Here, when there's a case being heard before the triers of facts and you tell them this is a scientific result, people like me on the outside will tell you, we want you, when you make that statement, we want that statement grounded in the generally accepted definition of science. Empirical, there's no way around empiricism at this level from our perspective. So what is this belief in falsifiability bias? Well, I want to bring up some examples. It turns out that the electron behaves like a little magnet. We physicists call that the strength of that magnet we call the G value. And so we've been measuring this thing for 50 or 60 years. And about a decade ago, the values that we measured for the G was 2.002, 324, 3039. That was the measured value. The theoretically, by the way, we can calculate this with math. The same value is what's called relativistic quantum field theory. It's what people like me were taught to do when we entered graduate school. And the theoretical prediction is 2.002, 324, 304, then a 4. And you'll notice the top two numbers don't match. One is the observed value, the other is the mathematical prediction of the value. And one thing about science which doesn't seem to be generally understood, at least by persons in the street, is if you ask the scientists for a number, we will give you 2. We will give you our best measured value of whatever it is you're asking for. But we will also tell you about what we call the error bars, which translates into ranges of confidence, or in engineering into tolerances. We will tell you both of these numbers because we know that if we give you one without the other, that first one is actually relatively useless. So on the basis of this principle of falsifiability, you've also got to be concerned about how well you know something. And that's what the confidence range of the error bar is all about, is the quality of how sure are you about what you're saying as an answer. Humans are never infinitely perfect, so it will be impossible to drive that number to 0. I'm pretty confident. But we do the following. You come back a decade later, and I went to the NIST site, and you look for the same magnetic property of the electron, and what you'll find is that the measurement is 1,000 times better now than it was 10 years ago. It's so good that I'm not even sure that theorists have caught up in making a prediction, which is why you only see 2 numbers here, the measured value and the uncertainty. I don't know what the theoretical value is. I haven't seen anyone who's actually gone out and calculated it. So falsifiability puts the onus onto accuracy. But the other thing about falsifiability, why we have this peculiar sort of way of thinking about things and why we worry about the range of uncertainty is because when a theory is falsified, it doesn't mean it's wrong. Because in fact, when our countries put people on the moon, we were just using the laws of Newtonian gravity. We did not use general relativity to put people on the moon. Probabilities are important. Here's a little game I like to play with my freshman students. Sometimes in some classes I say, I want you to flip a coin 4 times and then figure out what's the most likely outcome. And the way that you do it is you just make a little table. If you flip the coin 4 times and you came up heads every time, you look at that list on the top. If you flip the coin 4 times and got 3 heads and 1 tail, it could be any of those 3 things in the middle. If it were 2 tails, 2 heads, it could be the number there. This is what probability is all about. It's just counting the number of ways that things can happen. Now, of course, the dreaded word fraction enters these things. I don't know how many of you talk to people on the street about fractions. I don't normally do that myself because that's not a way to make friends. Fractions are kind of scary in our society. If you don't really just talk to a neighbor. On the other hand, as a scientist dealing with uncertainties, I have to be extraordinarily comfortable with fractions. And so if I were ever called to testify in a case, in which, by the way, I've never been, this is one thing that I would be very, very cautious about explaining to a general jury of my fellow students, things that have to do with fractions. And you have to really strive hard hard to make sure that you are clearly transmitting ideas about these things, because there's already a level of discomfort out there. Probabilities come in. This is something called a standard distribution, which I'm sure many of you have worked with. And so this, for my community, is how we decide that we've actually found something. In particular, if you apply, what we say in particle physics is that phi sigma means discovery. What that means is, here's a normal distribution. You can see 1, 2, 3, I marked out 1, 2, and 3 standard deviations to the right as well as to the left, putting negative numbers to the left. So if I go out 5 standard deviations, I have to go out I have to go out 2 more units to the right. This standard distribution curve means that when you get there, you're talking about things that are 1 part in a million. So when we say we found the Higgs boson at CERN, like we did in 2012, we're talking about an experiment where the likelihood that we are wrong is less than 1 in a million. So phi sigma means discovery in science, at least my part of science. And then, of course, there's the greatest forensic mystery of all time. This is a little movie I like to show people. When Einstein completed his equations, they didn't actually predict a single beginning to our universe. There were 5 that were possible consistent with his equations. And in fact, the one that we have settled on today is the one in the middle where it says lambda greater than 0. That is, we think we live in a universe where the expansion is speeding up and the universe is flat. Now, how do we know this? We think the universe is about 13.8 billion years old. So how can we figure this out? Well, it's a little bit like going to a crime scene. There's evidence laying around, and you have to assemble the evidence in a coherent narrative. Now, we scientists do this because our hero, Albert Einstein, gave us basically a paradigm that we could match the evidence against a mathematical model. And that's what he completed in 1915. His work in general relativity, which was completed in 1915, starts when he's in a post office still. Einstein starts off as a postal clerk. Couldn't get a job as a professor when he got his PhD. Sat in a patent office for at least 3 years, maybe 4, thinking about physics. And that's where his beginning of general relativity, and it winds up in this mathematics. Now, I don't expect any of you to be experts in differential geometry, because that's what it takes to read this stuff, except David might actually know some of this stuff because of his background. He's shaking his head no, but he might remember some physics. But this is what science, from my perspective, looks like. It's ultimately tied up with mathematics. And we use mathematics as a lens for looking at the universe. And that's how we can get these assurances that we understand the universe with better than 1 part in a million accuracy. The other thing about falsifiable theories is that ultimately, probably, every theory will be falsifiable. Because you see, science is a dynamical process. That is, we will give you the best answer we are capable of giving you at the time you ask the question. As technology advances, we're going to be able to make more accurate measures. And just when you can make more accurate measures, you can look for more room for falsifiable. And if you falsify a previous theory, you then are responsible for putting something new in its place. And so we suspect science will go on like this forever. So we get to watch a snapshot of science. I mean, what we know is the best science right now is a snapshot. I'm not sure you want to bring that into the law, because there's this thing called closure of cases. And it would be horrible to think of a system of justice where next week you have something that says, oh, we got a new piece of evidence here, and so much for that trial. And I think, by the way, that that's a great fear in your community about accepting comments that come from the outside about forensic science. It's the fear of reopening closed cases. That's a horrible prospect for the families. Think of the emotional pain those families have gone through. So again, people like me cannot make that call. That's on you and the community that engages that service for our society. 1989, I mentioned something curious. So in 1989, earlier I talked about tribes' contributions to the discussion of using mathematics and trying cases. But in 1989, he did something really weird that has fascinated me ever since. He wrote this paper called The Curvature of the Constitutional Space, What Lawyers Can Learn from Modern Physics. And you might think that maybe he was onto the story that I've been telling you, but in fact he wasn't. This particular paper deliberates on the possibility that the law, like much of modern society, will ultimately bend under the influence of physics, basically. Well, that's what we've been talking about, but we were talking about the part of law that is around forensic science. He also includes in this a very interesting acknowledgement to Rob Fisher, Michael Dorff, Kenneth Chesebro, Gene Sperling, who went on to become prominent in our government in terms of the Economic Council, and a guy named Barack Obama. Curiously, however, I've read this paper several times. I find no mention of forensic science in this paper, which to me is extraordinarily curious when you start talking about how physics could have impact on jurisprudence. So there's some meta things I want to end up with. Why do we worry about things like falsifiability, scientific validity, validation? It's because of this paradigm of falsifiability is the generally accepted paradigm in how science works. Not absolutely accepted, because no thing in human history is, but the large majority. We worry about confidence intervals and inconclusive results. We worry about the weight of evidence in different ways. This is something that both of our committees weigh in on, and the way I think about it is we should break it into meta questions, like what distinguishes scientific proof from other claims of knowledge, how valid is falsifiability as a theory, as a legal theory. That's a meta question to me. Data, confidence intervals, inconclusive results, weight of evidence, and the final process. You have to worry about fit for purpose is perhaps one of the things that we've sort of touched on today. Black box experiments, which I've become an enormous fan of while my time on the commission let me become educated about what that was. By the way, we heard also today about performance evaluation. Thank you, proficiency testing. Thank you, I could not think of the question. We heard today about proficiency testing, and I'm actually an enormous fan of proficiency testing. For one reason, which is I've not seen taken up generally in the debate about science and forensic science. You see, often we scientists talk about a foundational literature on which a science rests, but in something like forensic science, it is so complicated, there's an alternate route where you might get to say, I have a reproducible, verifiable method of checking a system. And that would be performance evaluation, not of individuals, but of the system. Because then you could begin to quantify the degree of errors that the system produces as it is currently configured. This is a slightly different concept than proficiency evaluation, but it's an evaluation of the system looking at, and it's actually the opposite. We had a wonderful presentation earlier about proficiency testing, and at that time, the comment was made that not necessarily broad in terms of the amount of data you want to bring to the problem, but you see there's this thing called big data, and this is exactly based on broad data sets. And so one could imagine that if you do performance testing on the entire system, not trying to pick out individual people and their rates of error, what have you, but the system as a whole, that's something that has a scientific validation to it. That's something we scientists can buy into, big time. But again, I've not seen any motion in that direction. And I think, Matt, I remember I talked about this the entire 3 or 4 years I was on the commission, that to me, that's the ultimate route that's saying, let's create this literature that acts as the foundation. So anyhow, let me talk about your sociology. What the 2009 report did, in my mind, is the following. First of all, it didn't say this. These are my own personal observations of looking at you over the course of the last 6 years. I think you were actually 4 different communities. The communities that I've been able to detect among you is something I call legal culture and models, so that's the judges and the lawyers. There's also the law enforcement culture and models, clearly, because law enforcement is basic customer. But there are two other components that I find very interesting. There's the scientific culture. Well, that's basically the forensic scientists, the practitioners who use these technologies to produce the evidence. And then there's an element of engineering in process engineering, because the demands on you collectively are so large, it looks like an industry that produces a big mass product. And so therefore, process engineering culture and technology resides kind of in you because of the loads of what you have to dispense on a regular basis. So that's who you look like to me. The 2009 report said forensic science currently is basically in this dumbbell shape, dominated by the culture of legal and law enforcement, with science and process engineering playing a rather lesser role. That's one way to interpret what the 2009 report said. Some people think that the 2009 report said, well, this is what you should aim for. There are people who believe that. On scientists, I know scientists who believe this. I am not one of them. Instead, I choose to interpret the 2009 report as saying there's a question about what the balance should be. And that balance can only be worked out by knowledgeable people in the community. That's the way I interpret it. Now, we're going to keep pushing you, because you haven't gotten, we don't think you've gotten to the point where we're comfortable saying that, yes, this is a field where we see solid evidence that scientific foundations are in place. We don't, those of us on the exterior are not comfortable making that statement now. But you can put it in a better position. But it won't be us, it will be you doing this. Technology will continue to press the boundaries. I recently bought an iPad, and what I found out is when I went to the Apple store to buy my new iPad, because the old one stopped working, the guy said, let me have your, I think he used my thumb. He said, let me have your thumb. I'm like, what do you want my thumb for? He said, I'm going to teach your machine to recognize your thumbprint. And I pressed it and rolled it a few times, what have you. And eventually my machine learned how to identify my thumbprint. So I don't have to enter my password anymore. I can just lay my thumb down on the screen and it will answer, it will wake up. It's me. Now, the fact that companies like Apple and Google are looking at thumbprint as a security measure, just like the original appearance of thumbprints back in India in the 1850s, when we started there, means that when we come to discussion, particularly of fingerprint analysis, it's likely that we are on the cusp, and this was mentioned actually in the earlier talk, it's likely that we are on the cusp of a true revolution in fingerprint matching. Now, we already have automatic finger recognition systems in the country at a national level, but if my iPad can learn to recognize my thumb, then you can imagine that somebody out there is going to develop a product that is much more flexible and that might be able to use the national databases to become very smart, because in fact the way AI works is it takes huge databases and then, as someone mentioned, the algorithms start to answer questions and eventually it gets smart. Now, I must admit to you, I don't really understand how this process works, but I'm on the verge of trying to use it to solve some of my problems in theoretical physics. And so this technology is out there, it's going to impress us. And this is one example of technology on the cusp that I think is going to be an enormous wave that all of us who are interested in using forensic science as a means to a higher quality of justice will have to be aware of. If these things are really good, then it's going to be a real challenge to fingerprint experts. And by the way, since I'm talking about fingerprints, let me acknowledge a couple of people. Jeff Salyers let me visit the Defense Forensics Laboratory outside of Atlanta a few years ago. And then Joseph Alejandro, who is a detective here in New York, offered me the opportunity to go out to the Bronx and see the New York Forensics Laboratory. So when I say I've been looking at you folks, I mean, I'm seriously looking at you from many different angles. And then finally, I like to remind people, this is J. Edgar Hoover, and we all know, he has his fans and his detractors these days, but I always believe that when someone says something that's right and does something good for the country, we have to acknowledge that. And it's his last sentence. This is a YouTube video I found a couple of years ago when I began studying your community. And the last sentence of his statement is that no case ever ends for the FBI until it is solved and closed with the conviction of the guilty or the acquittal of the innocent. And to me, that's a gold standard that forensic science must shoot for. The conviction of the guilty or the acquittal of the innocent. So this is a longer list of folks I owe so much to. Jeremy Triplett, Mark Sterolo, obviously Matt over here, Mark LeBeau, Eric Lander. These are the folks that got me started thinking about who you folks were and offering me the opportunity to study you. I owe a special debt to David Kay for today's presentation because I was so worried about speaking to you. I played Luke and he played Yoda. And if you're interested in this sort of Einstein-Eddington thing, I have a book coming out in the fall where we've actually tried to explain to non-scientists how that part of the process played out. It's not about Eddington, because as I said, today is actually the 100th anniversary of Eddington's observation, 100 years ago. But we're actually trying to tell you how people actually get to do this stuff and how they brought us that part of going from Newton, falsification because of Einstein, based on observation. And then, of course, there's information about me. This PowerPoint, I think, is, what happens to this PowerPoint? Is it available?
It is available.
So this entire presentation, you didn't have to take any notes, folks. You can get this whole thing by just downloading. Thank you very much for your time.